So Izzy, a lot of learners tell me that they feel frustrated when they actually get the opportunity to speak because they freeze up. So like the ideas in their head aren't flowing out in a natural way like they would in their native language. Does this still happen to you when you speak English?
No, I never freeze up. But I would add that if I'm giving a presentation or if I'm on this podcast, maybe sometimes I need a moment to think, but I'm not freezing up. I'm just thinking like I would do in my native language. But I think freezing up is more related to translation, right? Like you're translating in your head. So I never freeze up, I would say, these days.
And how is that?
I think with time, I started to think in English. And I think it's all about the way your brain is wired, to process vocabulary.
What does that mean, how your brain is wired?
Yeah, like a wire is like literally a wire is like this rigid, hard string made of metal that you use to connect a machine, and it can maybe conduct electricity or data for that piece of machine. But this is more figurative. So the way your brain is wired, it's how things are connected in your mind, right? And how you process information. In this case, I'm saying that my brain and the brain of fluent speakers are wired, or they process data differently. I think we understand vocabulary, and when we see words and we hear words, we take that differently. We process that differently.
That makes perfect sense. How is it that your brain is wired to process information in English the same way that you would in Portuguese, in your native language?
I think there's two important things to highlight to really make that difference clear. The first thing is that I am thinking directly in English. I'm not thinking in Portuguese, which is my native language, and translating my thoughts to English. They're coming to me directly in English, and I think this is because of input. I just started to associate words and images and things I'm seeing with the sounds in English. So I know that this is like a pencil, because I've seen this enough and I've looked at it enough and already think like pencil, So I think that helps. So input would be the first thing that I would need to say is very important. And the second thing is the way you see words appearing together is important. So we call that collocations, when words, they come up together in sentences more frequently than normal, right? And I'm not thinking about words individually. They often come in word chunks in terms of sound. They sound very much like a sound unit. I can give you one example of a collocation, like make a decision, right? That sounds just like a single word, and maybe if you're more like a basic level learner and you hear that, you'd be like, what is that word? Make a decision. But those are 3 words. And make is the verb that very often will accompany decision, so I think that is the way, that you start seeing vocabulary once you have this mindset shift. You'd be like, it's like Lego bricks, even. Like in another podcast, we talked about that, right? How words are more like Lego bricks, that they go together.
So that gives you a leg up or an advantage when you're speaking, because you're not trying to think of individual words, or you're not translating in your head, but rather you have chunks of information that go together, that when you want to express an idea, you're putting chunks together, the right chunks together, rather than trying to have to think about every single word, which can cause you to freeze up, or just to speak slowly, robotically, unnaturally. So I thought a really nice way we could approach this topic today is to look actually at the mistakes that most learners make when it comes to learning vocabulary. And you've already actually hinted at some of them. So we'll come back to some of these ideas that we're talking about. But a big thing that we believe here at Real Life English is that you shouldn't just learn English. It's not something that you should just study as a school subject, but it's something that you need to live. In fact, live it is a foundational component of our Real Life Way methodology, which is our unique way of teaching English. So I thought a really fun way for us to approach this living it today would be with a book that I believe both of us are big fans of, which is Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, definitely my favorite fiction book, I would say. It's perfect for kids, adults. If you're learning a new language, there's always a version of Harry Potter, the first one, for example, I think is perfect because it introduces you to the story, and also it was made for kids, right? Like really young kids too. So the vocabulary would be perfect for you to learn there as well.
Yeah. In fact, it's nice that you say that because it's, I think, one of the first books I read in German, and it was the first book I read in Spanish. So the native language of it, or the original language, is English. But even if you're learning another language, the translations are really well done in most languages. So it can be a great resource to depend on for language learners. So, and in fact, actually, I even thought of this because right now I'm reading like a version of Harry Potter. Basically, a super fan in Brazil made a Brazilian version of it. So it even takes a lot of things from Brazilian culture and politics and social issues and things like this. And the first book is called 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗶𝗀𝗶 and it's really nice because it takes some of the things that we love about Harry Potter, but it's totally Brazilian. So it's one I'd recommend to you if you're wanting something that's kind of close to home but gives you those Harry Potter vibes. And it's been phenomenal for me to pick up a lot of new vocabulary, collocations in Portuguese.
I've heard you mention it a few times already. I need to pick that up. Have a Kindle, so you can just download that.
There you go. So the excerpt that I got for us to learn with today is from the first chapter, and it's actually the first description that we hear of Dumbledore. If you haven't read Harry Potter, it's one of the most iconic characters in the books. And so let me just jump into it, and then we'll take a look at some common vocabulary learning mistakes with some examples from it. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which both were long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore.
Nice. Epic.
Right? And this is a good example because there's several pieces of advanced vocabulary here to look at what most learners would do, what they would approach this with. Even for myself, the first time I was reading in German, and which I think was my first experience reading in a foreign language, what I did was taking notes of individual words and adding their translation, for example, to a spaced repetition system, or maybe if you just take physical notes, you would do word translation. And of course, are a lot of advanced vocabularies here. We saw like tuck, swept, crooked. These are advanced words. And if you're not using the Real Life English app yet, this is a really great way for you to learn some of the collocations and vocabulary that we're going to be talking about today, and to never forget them with vocabulary flashcards. That way, when you do get in a conversation, you have them readily available to you. And we have all sorts of nice features to help you to make them a part of your active vocabulary. So check that out for free in the Apple App Store, Google Play Store, or by clicking the link in the description of this podcast. So many learners approach vocabulary by memorizing long lists or by reading something like this and looking up every single individual word and translating it. But the problem with that is oftentimes, and I believe you hinted at this, is that sometimes translation doesn't work perfectly. So an example I can use from the other day, I was meeting with Chi, who's our producer here. Hopefully he doesn't mind me using this example. I guess if he does, he'll be editing this so he can edit it out. But in Spanish and Portuguese and many Latin languages, there's the same word for missed and lose. And we were having a video call, and I think the connection cut for a moment. And so he meant to say, I lost you, which is like, the connection cut. So I couldn't hear you. I couldn't see you anymore. But he said, I missed you, which is like, I haven't seen you in a long time, so I really missed you. And so, it's a common mistake to use miss and lose wrong because people are translating directly from their language. And when you do that, then you're not having the right one. So if you actually were learning instead collocations of what collocations go with miss, what collocations go with lose, then you'll actually use them correctly in every situation. Or another example that a lot of learners confuse is make and do. That there's just one word for this in many different languages. And so someone might say, do a cake instead of make a cake, or make your homework when it's supposed to be do your homework.
Yeah, because both mean the same, right? In your native language, my native language of Portuguese, we say do and make for the same things. It's like fazer. It's the same verb. So when you translate, you don't know which one to use, right? Same thing. I mentioned make a decision. A lot of people say do a decision, right? It's just to perform an action, do make. But decision is always collocated with make, not do. And it's just something that naturally fits for me because I've heard it so many times. So it's just natural.
Yeah. So if you're taking literally the word like fazer and translating it as you would for any single thing, then all the time, right, in your head, you might be using one or the other because you haven't actually learned in chunks and without translating. So in this short excerpt, we saw some words like tuck, swept, crooked, that if you were to just translate those, then you might find different definitions of them. For example, if you looked up swept, which is the participle of sweep, then you might see that's like, oh, it's to clean the floor. So you might be thinking that, but it's not that at all because it's talking about how his cloak swept the ground. It doesn't mean that he's cleaning the ground with his cloak with this thing he's wearing. It means that he is. It means that the cloak is dragging lightly across the ground. So we have different definitions that sweep can be to clean with a broom, or it can be to lightly drag across something. And by just translating, you might be missing the ball there.
Even though I think it helps paint a picture, right? It becomes more visual as if it were sweeping, the floor, but it is not literally. He's not intending to actually clean anything, right?
Exactly. So the second mistake I see a lot of learners making is not applying always learning to learn grammar. Now, always learning, that's another part of our Real Life Way methodology. And you were kind of talking about earlier how our brains are wired in different ways. And I think successful English learners, one way that their brain is wired is that they have this mentality of always looking for opportunities to learn. And this isn't just limited to vocabulary. We can also do this with many different grammatical things. If you're listening to music, if you're watching TV, if you're reading something. And I find that most learners, when it comes to grammar, they think it's something that they have to study. They have to sit down, they have to do a textbook or do exercises online or something like this. But you can find, for me, most grammar I've learned in languages that I've learned in my adult life, so not in school. I've learned more, not passively, but more through input and through doing things that I enjoy. So one example I saw here, for example, is the first sentence, nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. A lot of learners mix up in, on, and at, not knowing when to use which of those prepositions. So we can see here, on Privet Drive. So if someone has this mindset of always learning, they're going to see that, be a bit curious of like, oh, it's on Privet Drive. So Privet Drive, that's a street. So any sort of street, whether it's a street or a way or a drive or an avenue, I should use on. You could see all sorts of things like this if you're a bit curious and you're just analyzing a little bit more, doing that a little bit of extra work with the things that you're consuming.
It's all about those patterns, right? And if you see them enough, like you learn through repetition and it's more natural. And you're living your English when you're doing that, and you're bringing in some activation too. So you're also activating by just purposefully looking for those similar patterns, right? Those similar features in the construction of the sentences too. So you can learn verb tenses by doing this. I myself learned, I believe, all verb tenses, all 12, right? By just doing this. And in the previous episode, Xenia and I were talking about grammar. And as I said, a lot of times I don't know exactly the name of the verb tense I'm using, the name in grammar, but I am using it, and probably correctly, because I've just seen it enough and I've analyzed. It's like, this comes first normally. Okay, so it sounds more natural to me now, and that's the way I roll. That's the way I go with grammar. Which
is, if you think about it, that's very similar to how we learn our native language is grammar. And we might refine that a bit, meaning that we polish it up or we make it better, shinier, more accurate when we go to school and we have to study our own language's grammar. But in general, we're probably learning like 80 to 95% of it just because we're listening to our parents all the time and then listening to things that we're encountering in our life and so on. So you can get to a very good level of grammar, definitely a functional level, a level that's going to be enough for most learners without needing to necessarily sit down and study it in a textbook. We've just really had drilled into our heads that we're supposed to learn grammar this way because it's how it was taught to us in school, right?
Yeah, but if you go right now and you ask any person in your life, like a friend or somebody from your family, a question about grammar, they are probably not going to know the answer. It's like, oh, what verb tense are you using there? Right. So why do you want to have that same mindset for a language that you're learning, a new language, right?
Exactly. Don't be so hard on yourself. The third mistake I often see learners making is not considering the context enough. So that's similar to what we were talking about before of how sweep was being used here. So it's not talking about cleaning up the floor, but it's talking about something dragging lightly. Mm-hmm. And there's so many examples of this in English, I think in every language. But one that I think about all the time with this is the verb get, because get is just such a versatile verb in English. For example, we have get ahead, get a gift, get a bite, get lucky. These all are being used in completely different definitions. So you have to really pay attention to what's going on, to the context to understand it. It's not enough just to know that get often means the same as have, right? If you say get ahead, it means to advance. If you say get a gift, it's receive a gift. If you say get a bite, it means to eat something. If you say get lucky, it means to be fortunate. So in none of those is it actually meaning have.
Or even get lucky in another context could be just like to have sex, right, with another person.
Exactly, yeah. So you really need to pay attention to the context there. And this is what we were discussing too about that the same way with grammar, that you just do that little bit of extra analysis, that little bit of extra curiosity about what's happening and what you're reading or what you're listening to. And with grammar, you might see like how is a certain verb being used or how is a certain preposition being used. In this case, you might pay attention to what words are often going together. So for example, we often have adjectives and nouns that go together, like strong coffee. We don't say, that a coffee is dark or a coffee is bitter. We'll say strong coffee, meaning that it's not coffee that is too light or too watery. And it's not talking about literally strong, right? Like it has muscles.
Yeah, you'd imagine you just picture like a mug with coffee with like biceps and arms or something. It's not that. Yeah. There's so many verbs, right? Like one of the verbs that I like when I hear it, it just like rolls off the tongue. It just sounds kind of cool. It's like drop it. When somebody is being when somebody's being annoying and you just want them to stop being annoying and saying whatever they're saying, just say like, hey, drop it, right? Which is different from literally dropping something. Mm-hmm. So if you don't know the context, if you're not aware of the context, you would know what they're talking about there. And there's even other phrases like drop the act, just like stop faking, like whatever you're doing, like you're faking it. So stop doing that.
Exactly. So there was a nice one here that they said that his nose is crooked. He has a crooked nose. Now, we wouldn't say bent here. We wouldn't say angled, twisted. We'd say a crooked nose. So these are two words that really go together to describe a nose like Owen Wilson, for example, for someone who has this nose that isn't straight. And crooked is a really advanced word, and there's not that many cases where we'd use it, but we would very often use it to describe that kind of nose.
You know what that reminds me? Because I've seen that in stories and just, I guess, cartoons, like a crooked house, right? Mm-hmm. Is that a more commonly associated with like Halloween, and you have a house that's like abandoned and there's something creepy going on there. So it's like it looks crooked.
Yeah. And maybe just to drive this point home, in other words, to reinforce it, if you were just learning the word crooked there in isolation, it's one of those words that's not useful except for in these contexts we talked about, like a crooked nose or crooked house. In these collocations, we pretty much always use that word, but just crooked by itself. So maybe if you had, for example, I'm thinking of a broom because we were talking about sweeping earlier. If you had the broom got a bend in it, you wouldn't say a crooked broom, you'd say a bent broom. So it's this kind of thing that if you just learn the word by itself, it's not going to be that useful for you. But if you learn the collocation, you're going to be using the right ones together that sound really good, at least to a native ear. I thought too, Izzy, you were talking earlier about how great Eminem is to learn, and you said that you had an example you wanted to bring from that. Maybe we could look at also how you can learn in context with music, for example.
Definitely another great source of living your English moments there, moments of immersion, as I like to call it. So the song is Lose Yourself, probably one of his most popular songs. And it's this motivational tune, right? You can listen to it before maybe going to the gym, or if you want to just like get excited about anything you're going to do next. It's a great one.
Get pumped up. That would be a nice collocation to use there.
So if you want to get pumped up, you should listen to this one. This is Lose Yourself. So I'm going to try and sing it here. Again, the other day I was singing Adele on this podcast, so I might as well try this. Eminem is a rapper, so maybe this will be more of a challenge. So this is how it goes. You better lose yourself in the music the moment you own it. You better never let it go. You only get one shot, do not miss the chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime. You better lose yourself in the music. So many.
You did great. You got like all the connected speech.
There you go, which is an important part of collocations too, right? A lot of times they will appear, if you're listening, if you're not just reading, they will sound connected a lot of times, right? A lot of these expressions that we...
And you can practice that yourself.
And that helps memorizing those words too, I would say. As a combination of words, as like a word chunk, it's so much easier to remember them later on.
That might almost be like a 3.5 or third and a half point here of a mistake a lot of learners make is, even if you're learning collocations, just learning the collocation, but not learning it as a word chunk, which would include the sound as well. So if you're listening to something, paying attention to what words go together, but also usually they'll create a sound unit. And maybe you could share some examples of that.
Straight from the lyrics here. So lose yourself. So you were talking about lose before, miss, lose. Here's another example of how you can use lose, the verb lose, but this is different from everything we've said here so far. So what does that mean, to lose yourself in something?
It's like when you achieve flow state, which is when you're so engulfed by something or you're so wrapped up in something that you lose, which you're using the word lose here, but all sense of time, all sense of maybe what's happening around you, you're just completely engrossed in that moment.
And then he says, so you better lose yourself in the music the moment you own it. So what is that, to own it?
If you own it, you take pride in something.
So it's just like, again, it goes hand in hand with lose yourself in the music, because lose yourself in the moment, because now you're so in it that you own it. You take pride in that. And I said hand in hand. I guess that's another collocation there, right? Because it's not literally, you're not actually picturing hands there. It's just like it's connected, right?
And you add some nice sound units there as well. That it's not hand in hand, it's hand in hand. It all flows together, right? Or own it. We don't give a space there. It's like own it, own it. The N links onto the it, right?
And you can see that too in let it go, which is here. So you better never let it go. I guess it's also present in a popular Disney song, right? From
That's
Frozen.
What I thought about.
So there you have, you're talking connected speech. So let it, and you have a flap T, or an American T, as we call it, in let. So let it sounds like a D. So it's like let it. And I think he drops the T there in it. So it's like let it. You just stop the flow of air. So it's let it go. You better never let it go. And we have two more expressions here. Only get one shot and once in a lifetime. But I'll leave those for you to learn on the app. If you're a listener, if you go to the RealLife app right now, you can see the full transcript, as Ethan said earlier, and learn all about these expressions with flashcards.
Nice. So the last mistake that I often am seeing learners making, especially nowadays, is that we have all these amazing tools that people aren't taking advantage of. Like maybe you're just getting sucked into learning vocabulary lists or lessons where they teach you all the vocabulary about X topic. But as we've already seen, that's not the most effective way to go about learning. There's much more natural ways. One of these tools that I have found is just a game changer, meaning something that is innovative and makes a humongous difference, is AI. So I really like ChatGPT for anything having to do with questions about language. And so just to give you guys a quick example of this, I headed over to Google News and just grabbed an interesting headline there. So this headline says, Julian Assange, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce his name, but he's the guy from WikiLeaks, cuts deal to plead guilty, gain freedom. So actually news headlines, usually they have a lot of collocations and expressions in them. So it can be, if you like reading the news, it can be a great way to learn these. So there's some nice things here like cut a deal, plead guilty, gain freedom, right? So just to give you guys an example of how I might use AI in my language learning is I would have a conversation with ChatGPT. Like if I'm doing this with Portuguese, for example, I'll actually try to always keep the conversation in Portuguese. So if I'm asking about some sort of, for example, the other day I saw a new expression in Portuguese while watching a Brazilian series, and I'll actually ask it in Portuguese, what does this expression mean? And it gives me the explanation in Portuguese. So what Izzy was saying earlier about not being in the habit of translating, this can help you just to start thinking more in your target language, which in this case would be English, right? So Izzy, I'm just going to pull out my phone here and open the ChatGPT app and actually try speaking with it. So sometimes I might write it, but it can also be great for your speaking practice to actually have a conversation with ChatGPT if you haven't tried that yet. What does it mean to cut a deal?
To cut a deal means to make an agreement or come to a negotiated settlement, often in business or politics. It's about reaching a compromise or arrangement that both parties can accept.
What about if someone is arrested? What does it mean to cut a deal in that context?
In the context of someone being arrested, to cut a deal usually refers to negotiating a plea bargain with the prosecution. This often involves the defendant agreeing to plead guilty to a lesser charge or provide valuable information in exchange for a reduced sentence or other concessions.
Can you give me some more examples with cutting a deal?
Here are a few more examples. One in a business setting. Two companies might cut a deal to merge, sharing resources and profits. 2. In sports, a team might cut a deal with a player to extend their contract for a few more years. 3. In politics, two parties might cut a deal to pass a piece of legislation, agreeing to support each other's proposals. These examples show how cutting a deal involves negotiation and compromise to reach an agreement.
Yeah, so we can see even just beyond the context that I saw here, we can use this expression in all sorts of different contexts, right? So it's just really mind-blowing tool for language learning.
It really is. And if you feel like it's the vocabulary it's using is too difficult, you could even ask, hey, I'm learning English, I'm more at an intermediate level, so could you use more basic level words? Or you can just ask it anything you want, right? Before you ask it any questions like define this or give me examples of that.
All right, so to wrap up today's episode, I thought a fun way that we could actually learn some more collocations and put your English knowledge to the test is to play a game I'm calling Phrase Frenzy.
It's a frenzy.
A frenzy is where many people are going crazy, I suppose, and we'll use it in this sort of sense to say like, you're having a crazy fun time.
Yeah, maybe if you go see a soccer game at the stadium, people, like when your team scores, you basically experience like a frenzy there in the crowd.
That most certainly is true. When I lived in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, there was actually two teams. There are two teams in Belo Horizonte, and they're rivals. And when there was a game between the two of them, it felt like the city would literally shake when one of them would make a goal. So you can see definitely that felt like a frenzy around football, around soccer. So it's pretty simple. I have some sentences, and each of them has a collocation, but one word of the collocation. So they're each 2-word collocations, but one word is going to be blank, and you'll have to guess what the other word is. These are all quite advanced ones. So I think even for a native speaker, they could be difficult. But are you up for the challenge, Izzy?
I am. Let's do this. What's the worst that could happen?
So the first one is, it hurt so bad. I was in excruciating...
Pain?
You got it. Excruciating pain. So these are two words. Excruciating, we don't use in that many contexts. It means an extreme degree of something, but it's often collocated in this way, excruciating pain, to mean a large degree of pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if we'll define all of these, but again, if you listen to this on the RealLife English app, you can get vocabulary flashcards for all of them there.
And I would say that I would not even use the word excruciating outside of this particular collocation. But I do use it with pain because, tell me if I'm right, like excruciating is more, it's related to like this kind of face where you're just like, oh, in so much pain that your face is just like twisting and your muscles are just super tense. Is that it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a level of pain that you can't think about or do anything else. All right, number 2. In the movie Challengers, Zendaya's character does not like to lose. She's fiercely blank.
Competitive.
Yeah, fiercely competitive. So that's another collocation. We don't use fiercely in that many settings, but again, it's like someone's fiercely competitive. Sometimes there are issues I prefer to remain ignorant on. Maybe that's why they say ignorance is blank.
Ah, a bliss. Is that it?
So we say ignorance is bliss or blissful ignorance.
Ignorance is bliss, not a bliss.
Exactly. So bliss is like happiness, like a state of happiness, but you wouldn't say ignorance is happiness or ignorance is joy. They're synonyms, but it just doesn't sound right. And that's what collocations, I think, are all about. Okay. Teenagers' lies are usually easy to see through because they're fundamentally blank.
Short-legged? Is that a word?
That is. That's not the collocation, but it's a nice advanced piece of vocab. So the collocation that we use with fundamentally often in this context would be fundamentally flawed. Okay. Do you not care about her feelings? You showed a blank disregard to her emotions.
Here, let me just see. Maybe total or complete?
So it's blatant disregard.
A
blatant disregard for something.
I think blatant has this connotation that is like shocking too, right? So it's more than just complete or full or any of that. Blatant is just like you get shocked when you may get shocked when you see it, right?
Okay. It rains all the time in Ireland, so water is blank available.
Widely?
So actually here it's readily available.
Readily. Nice. Again, it's just like that connotation that you get where widely it would be okay here, but readily, as you're saying, like readily available, that is totally something that I hear more often.
Yeah, something about widely available, like I understand it makes sense, but it doesn't sound quite as good as readily available. All right, last one. So I think so far you've gotten 4, which actually is really good because these were difficult. And I think the last ones, I tried to have ones that weren't quite so difficult to start out so you could get on a roll. But I found Brazilian mothers sure love when someone has a blank appetite.
Okay, I'm drawing a blank here for this one. I don't know. What is it?
That's a good collocation. Draw a blank.
Which is like, I don't know. There's nothing in my mind. So what is that?
What if I said that here at RealLife English, we try to bring people on our team who are blank learners?
Voracious?
Yeah. So this is a word that we use often for learning and for appetite. Voracious appetite or voracious learner.
You can even, I think, use the word eat or eat up, the phrasal verb, referring to content or knowledge, information, right? Maybe the book is so good, Harry Potter is so good, you just like eat it up in a single day.
Exactly.
I've done that actually. That's because I've read it so many times, and I think the second time, third time, it was just like something that I did in a single day. Just reading the entire book, so I ate it up.
So I'll give you that last point. So I think you got 5 out of 7. That is very I think that I don't know if I would have done better than that. So I think that that's very impressive.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. So guys, thanks so much for joining us for today's lesson. Hopefully you've gotten some tips that will actually help you to learn vocabulary more effectively, to feel more confident and able to express your ideas fluently when you get into a conversation. And if you find that these lessons are helping you, a free way that you can support us so we can continue bringing you great lessons like this is by hitting the subscribe button and the bell down below on YouTube so you don't miss a single new lesson. Also hit the like button because this helps YouTube to know that you enjoy the content so that more people can have fun learning with us. If you are listening to us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or any other podcast platform, you can give us a 5-star review. Again, this helps people from all around the world who are learning English to discover our content so that they can also have a lot of fun learning with us. And finally, be sure to download the RealLife app and take your English to a next level with these podcasts. And if you do, leave us a 5-star review in your favorite app store. And that said, no matter what divides us, that which unites us is far greater. 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Many English teachers and schools put too much emphasis on grammar and not enough emphasis on speaking. They spread the idea that you have to know all the grammar rules before you start speaking, which can have a negative effect on your confidence when you finally get to speaking. Now, you may be asking yourself, how can I possibly learn to speak English correctly if I don't study grammar? Well, that's exactly what Izzy and I are going to be talking about in today's episode. So stick around, because this podcast may just change your life forever.